Okay, this is our unit on evolution and adaptations. So we are now going to talk about how living things have changed over time. And this little funny little picture and clip that you can read. That was kind of funny. Um, okay, so our essential question for today is what determines which traits will help an organism survive in its environment? This set of notes goes with Learning Target 17. Explain what adaptations mean and how they impact survival and reproductive success. So after the notes and practice, you'll be able to tell me what adaptation is, give examples, and you'd be able to analyze different situations and determine whether that adaptation will help that living thing reproduce. Okay, so let's first start off with talking about a species. A species is a group of organisms that share similar characteristics. Okay, a trait that species could have is a characteristic of an organism that may or may not help it survive. Genetic traits have been passed from parents to offspring. So a trait is something, it could be good or bad. It could be something that helps the organism survive, or it could be something that doesn't help the organism survive. So when scientists started to look at how living things evolved, how living things change over time, they started to come up with some theories on that. One of the first theories that was given was called acquired characteristics. This was by a scientist named Lamarck, and this theory has not been supported, but it was one of the earlier ones, and we'll go over it and you can figure out why it's not supported today. So Lamarck thought that characteristics or traits developed during a parent's or an offspring's lifetime and are inherited by the offspring. So for example, if dad develops large muscles from working out and lifting weights, then Lamarck thought the offspring would have large muscles. If mom dyes her hair blonde, then Lamarck thought the offspring will automatically have blonde hair. We know this isn't true. Okay, you can't just have a certain trait in your lifetime and be able to pass that on. So this was a theory that was not supported, and so just to give you an idea, this is what they used to think. And then Darwin came along, and he came up with the most highly supported theory today. He came up with a theory of natural selection. He basically said that organisms with traits best suited to their environment are more likely to survive. And he did a lot of this research in the Galapagos Islands. He looked at a type of bird, the finches. On the Galapagos Islands, there's about 24 different species of finches. Well, Darwin came up with the questions, look, well, why are there 24 different species? Those species must have evolved or come from one species of one species of finches, and then over time changed into 24 different species. So he did a lot of research, and a lot of his support for this theory came from the Galapagos Islands. So there's a picture of his finches. He noticed when he did the research with the finches, he looked at their beaks and how their beaks were adapted to eat certain amounts of foods. So he thought all the finches came from one species of finches and then over time changed into 24 different species. And we're going to talk about how that could be possible. So Darwin came up with some principles for the theory of natural selection. These are pretty important principles. This is what he found from his research. He found that organisms will produce more offspring than can survive. For example, okay, any offspring that survive is going to be able to pass on the traits from the parents. So living things like to reproduce and have more offspring so they have a better chance of survival, because some get preyed upon and they don't survive. And so the more offspring you have, the better chance you have of passing on your traits. That's why when, if you've seen fish, and even when we dissect frogs or reptiles, they have a ton of eggs that can turn into offspring. Not all of them turn into offspring and survive. You guys remember from Finding Nemo, that movie? Okay, all those fish eggs, Nemo's brothers and sisters, they all got eaten except for Nemo. So that's why offsprings will produce more offsprings than can survive, because they want to have a better chance of passing on their traits. Okay, the second part of that Darwin's theory of natural selection is that differences, which we're going to call variations, occur among individual species. So even though, if you take a look at Finding Nemo, okay, even in between the clownfish, which is what Nemo is, they don't all look alike. And there's going to be some differences among that species. Just like humans, we don't all look alike. We're a species. And we don't all look alike. We're all a little bit different. So that's what variations are. And Darwin found that out. He found that there are differences among individual species. So then he said some of those differences or variations are passed to the offspring, just like if you look at your parents, you've gotten some of their variations passed down to you. Some were passed down, some weren't. Some of those variations will be helpful and will help the offspring survive and reproduce. So the offspring that get those helpful variations have a better chance of surviving and reproducing and passing on those helpful traits. Over time, offspring with helpful variations make up more of the population, and they can eventually become a separate species. For example, if we look at this finch that started out eating seeds, well, let's say there was a drought one year, and there weren't a lot of plants that were producing seeds. So if there was a finch that had a little bit longer beak, they could go out and dig around and eat insects. So this finch that had the longer beak will mate with another finch that has a longer beak. They'll pass on that long beak, which is a helpful variation to their offspring, and eventually they'll become a separate species. Okay? So that's kind of what he found out. Woo, I don't want to move that. That's what he found out from doing his research with the finches, the principles of natural selection. So please make sure you get these down in your notes. These are the 5 major principles that Darwin found out by studying evolution. Okay, so just again, a variation is an inherited trait that makes an individual different. They can either be helpful or harmful. If it is a helpful variation, then we call it an adaptation. So an adaptation is only something that helps an organism survive. Okay, so some examples. This is actually an albino peacock. Okay, this actually is not an adaptation. This is actually what we call a mutation. If it's a variation that's not helpful, then we call that a mutation. And a albino peacock, see how it shows up? It doesn't blend in at all with the background. Then that would not be a helpful variation. Okay, some helpful variations that are adaptations, if you look at how a giraffe evolved, this is showing you giraffes started out looking like this. They had shorter necks. Okay, they were able to eat the grass off the ground. Over time, the environment changed. So there was taller trees and less grass. It became more of a deserty climate. So the giraffes that had the longer necks that could reach up into the trees survived because they had an adaptation, and then they passed that on to their offspring. So over time, the giraffes that didn't have a longer neck, eventually their population decreased and they probably became extinct, and the giraffes with the longer necks survived, and that created a new species of giraffes. So over time, the ones with the longest necks passed down that variation, that adaptation to their offspring, and they survived. Some other helpful adaptations, obviously camouflage. Okay, we've got our lizard and this sandfish over here. They can blend into their environment to help them escape predators. That's an adaptation because it's going to help them survive, so they will survive and pass that trait on to their offspring. So the big idea about Darwin's theory of natural selection is that if a living thing has helpful variations, have adaptations that help them survive in their environment, they're going to pass those adaptations down to their offspring, and then they're going to be able to reproduce, and they're going to be able to survive. And eventually they might turn into a new species.